Já estamos ao vivo pelo YouTube.
Perfeito, obrigada. Então, boa tarde a todas, todos e todes, em nome do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Sociologia e Antropologia da UFRJ, Rio de Janeiro. Queremos dar as boas-vindas ao professor Steven Feld, que veio hoje compartilhar uma fala, uma aula, um momento com a gente. Eu vou agora passar a dar algumas indicações de como vai funcionar o evento. A gente vai inicialmente começar com o Wagner Chaves, professor aqui da casa, fazendo uma pequena, breve introdução à obra do professor Steven. Aí depois a gente vai passar a transmissão da videoaula, que dura em torno de uns 40 minutos, e aí a gente passa para o debate. E aí eu vou falar um pouquinho agora, se a gente tiver necessidade, a gente fala de novo na hora de abrir o debate. Quem está fazendo a tradução consecutiva é o professor Luiz Costa, que também é professor da casa, e o professor Luiz, em termos de realmente como a gente está fazendo a transmissão pelo Zoom e também pelo YouTube, e por fins realmente de inclusão, ele pede que todo mundo faça as perguntas em português. Se as perguntas surgirem enquanto estiver rolando a videoaula, o ideal é que as pessoas escrevam essas perguntas e aí ele fará a tradução consecutiva em português e para inglês. E depois fará a tradução consecutiva da resposta do professor Steven. Se alguém preferir fazer a pergunta, em vez de escrever a pergunta, é só se registrar, tá bom? Então, é assim que vai funcionar em termos da gente poder fazer esse debate, e a gente também está pensando em 45 minutos de debate. Então, é mais ou menos assim que funciona, né? Wagner, Felipe, eu estamos muito felizes com esse encontro. Professor Steve, thank you so much for being with us today. So, agora passo a palavra para o Wagner, que fará uma breve introdução à obra do professor Steven.
Obrigado, Tati. Boa tarde para todas, todos e todos. É uma alegria imensa estarmos aqui hoje reunidos nessa atividade com o professor Steven Feld, que muito generosamente aceitou o nosso convite, e a gente agradece muito. E também a presença de todos, ver aqui a casa cheia, a casa não, a tela, cheia de amigos, de colegas, de alunos. Eu vou ficar responsável por apresentar, trazer algumas notas do Steve, da trajetória dele e da produção, e eu vou pedir licença para vocês, para ficar mais ou menos no tempo, para ler um texto que eu preparei, tá bom? Então, vamos lá. Steve Feld é antropólogo, músico, produtor, cineasta e artista sonoro. Professor emérito de antropologia da Universidade do Novo México e pesquisador sênior na Escola de Estudos Avançados em Santa Fé, Novo México, Estados Unidos. Entre 1975 e 2000, desenvolveu estudos em antropologia do som, estética e poética entre os Kaluli, originários da região de Boçave e Nova Guiné. Na vivência junto a esse povo, Steve logo cedo percebeu que, para compreender os significados do som e das performances Kaluri, seria fundamental que ele aprendesse com eles a escutar. Esse exercício de aprendizado e treinamento da escuta fez com que Steve notasse, entre outras coisas, que o ambiente acústico da floresta, atravessado pelas sonoridades de pássaros, insetos, rios e cachoeiras, reverbera em uma série de práticas vocais dos Kaluli, dentre as quais podemos mencionar as sailema, que são choros cantados pelas mulheres, e os gizalos, quando os homens, assumindo o ponto de vista dos pássaros, provocam o choro em quem os escuta. Se no primeiro caso o choro desperta, provoca o canto, No segundo, é o canto que faz chorar. Então, como fruto dessa pesquisa e convivência duradoura com os Kaluli, o Steve publica, em 1982, a sua monografia, hoje clássica, Som e Sentimento, Sound and Sentiment, que traz o subtítulo Pássaros, Lamentos, Poética e Cantos na Expressão Kaluli. Além do livro, diversos LPs e CDs são produzidos a partir dessa imersão no mundo sonoro Kaluli, entre os quais Voices of the Rainforest, de 1991, em parceria com Mick Hart, baterista da banda de rock Grateful Dead. O CD alcançou a impressionante marca de mais de 50 mil cópias vendidas, amplificando assim as sonoridades da floresta, até então restritas a um público acadêmico, para um conjunto bem mais amplo e diversificado de ouvintes. Além de Voices of the Rainforest, Steve ainda vai produzir e editar em 2001, pelo Smithsonian Folkway Recording, a coletânea Bossave, Rainforest Music of Papua New Guinea. Trabalho esse que apresenta em 3 CDs e um livro um panorama musical de 25 anos de convivência de Steve com 3 gerações de Kaluli. Bom, simultaneamente a essa pesquisa etnográfica na Nova Guiné, a partir do final dos anos de 1980 e ao longo de toda a década seguinte, Steve vai desenvolver um segundo interesse de pesquisa em torno dos processos de circulação, comodificação e globalização musicais, analisando questões como ética, equidade e relações de poder entre músicos indígenas, estrelas do rock e a indústria musical. Temas como direitos coletivos, propriedade intelectual e apropriação cultural serão problematizados em ensaios críticos e reflexivos que abordam a chamada world music. Nesse período, Steve publica Da Esquizofonia à Sismogênese, Discursos e Práticas da World Music e World Beat, em 1995, Pop Pigmeu, A Genealogia da Mimes Esquizofônica, em 1996, e Uma Canção de Niná para a World Music, em 2000, sendo esse o último, o primeiro texto de Steve traduzido para o português, em 2005. Bom, o terceiro investimento de pesquisa se inicia nos anos 2000, quando Steve se engaja em uma série de projetos sobre a história e a sonoridade dos sinos, primeiramente na Europa, França, Finlândia, Noruega, Grécia, Itália e Dinamarca, e em seguida no Japão, em Gana e no Togo. Esses trabalhos foram publicados em diversos formatos, como a série de CDs e DVDs O Tempo dos Sinos, The Time of Bells, e o livro CD-DVD Skiros Carnaval. O quarto grande projeto de pesquisa de Steve tem início em 2004 e é dedicado ao estudo da musicalidade urbana diaspórica, da história, escuta e ressonâncias do jazz em Accra, Gana, fruto de um trabalho colaborativo com músicos e grupos ganenses, como o Accra Crane Station, grupo que se inspira em Joe Coltrane para criar experimentos sonoros, utilizando instrumentos como a ambira, xilofones e os afrifones, que são instrumentos de sopro criados por Ninoy Norte, que é um dos integrantes do grupo. E o Purpur, que são grupos ligados aos sindicatos de motoristas de ônibus e caminhões no município de Lá, em Accra, e que mantêm orquestras baseadas na sonoridade de buzinas, como a gente vai poder apreciar na videoaula que Steve apresenta hoje para a gente. Esses trabalhos em Accra foram apresentados em 10 CDs, 5 longa-metragens, dentre os quais Bufo Variations, com o multi-instrumentista Nioto Anand. Na aula de hoje, na videoaula, a gente vai ter o prazer de ouvir um magnífico solo de Nioto, improvisando a partir de um diálogo, de uma conversa com os sapos. A pesquisa e convivência com os músicos em Accra ainda resultou no livro Jazz Cosmopolitanismo em Accra, publicado em 2012, e que é um exercício de experimentação, dialogismo e polifonia narrativa. Bom, modulando agora para o tom dessa conversa de hoje com Steve, a gente pode dizer que uma das suas principais contribuições, entre tantas outras, é em torno da noção de acustemologia, que emerge nos anos 90, em 96, e propõe um exercício analítico e etnográfico de ampliação da concepção de som, indo além da ideia do som como coisa, estrutura, entidade ou substância, para o som como experiência, percepção, modo e método de conhecimento. Desde então, a proposta de uma acustemologia vem sendo uma potente ferramenta para se investigar relações através do som. Na acustemologia, o som é o que conecta, o que veicula, criando um ambiente relacional entre todos os seres, vivos e não vivos, humanos e não humanos, orgânicos e tecnológicos, que coabitam sonoramente um espaço compartilhado, por pássaros, rios e insetos em Bossave, sinos e ovelhas na Europa, buzinas, sopro, caminhões e discos de jazz em Acre. Com a proposta acustemológica, Steve vai evidenciar o escutar e o soar, sounding, como experiências relacionais, reveladoras de um mundo em que múltiplos agenciamentos se conectam através de vibrações e ressonâncias sonoras. A acustemologia ainda nos instiga a experimentar o som como meio de apresentação e representação das nossas pesquisas, através de composições estético-etnográficas, em formato de CDs, DVDs, instalações sonoras e outros meios que proporcionem às pessoas o contato pela escuta com o que nós escutamos em nossas pesquisas. Já finalizando essa breve apresentação, gostaria ainda de mencionar que Steve, em 2003, funda uma editora, uma gravadora, uma editora, a Voxlox, que desde então já produziu mais de 25 trabalhos, entre CDs, DVDs e livros, a grande maioria frutos de projetos de pesquisa, documentação e criação desenvolvidos na interface, ou, melhor, na encruzilhada da antropologia com as artes sonoras e visuais. Bom, é isso, gente. Muito obrigado. E tentei aqui fazer um apanhado breve e didático também do Steve, de coisas que ele vem pensando, e dessas, digamos que, 4 grandes frentes de investimento, de pesquisa e atuação, mas, obviamente, que a produção do Steve é muito mais ampla, e eu quis aqui só dar um gostinho também, um apanhado, para a gente dar continuidade aqui à nossa conversa. Obrigado.
Então, agora a gente segue para a videoaula. Uma questão que o Zoom nos impõe é que nos momentos em que tem imagens em movimento, tem um pouquinho de trava, então eu vou pedir que todo mundo feche as câmeras enquanto a gente estiver transmitindo a videoaula, tá? E depois a gente abre e se reencontra com as câmeras abertas depois da videoaula. Então, vou começar o compartilhamento. Eu só vou pedir que vocês me deem um ok que está funcionando, tá? Me deem um segundo para eu colocar aqui no tamanho grande e começar o compartilhamento. E aí, só alguém me fala, tá funcionando, tá?
Tá funcionando, Tati. Falta o áudio só.
Falta o áudio.
It's 1976,
Começou.
and I'm in a 2-seater single-engine propeller plane, flying low. This is the first picture I take coming down from the clouds. I'm beginning descent over the Bosavi rainforest region in Papua New Guinea. I'm getting close to a place that will consume the next 25 years of my research life and compel me to return again 20 years later to continue the work. But the future is not on my mind. I'm very much in the moment, simultaneously wrestling with close-up engine noise and the voice speaking inside me. I open my pocket notebook and write my first words. I'm being hurled into broccoli. The pilot has a map open on one knee and a Bible open on the other. He's an evangelist. I'm a heathen. He has a Cessna. I have a Nagra. He's doing the Lord's work. I'm cargo, revenue. We can't speak. It's too loud and we have nothing to say to each other. I have to deal with his noise and he has to deal with my silence. His ears are covered with headphones and he says things into a microphone at his lips. He's tuned into God and missionary shortwave radios. Roger. Is this why Levi-Strauss begins Tristropique with how he loathes travel? I came to the rainforest for intimate audibility. I wasn't thinking that the initial price would be visual claustrophobia. Now that I'm out of the broccoli and onto the ground looking up, how can I hear through the trees? The answer is immediate. This requires ears far more expert than mine, ears tuned locally. Each early morning and late afternoon, especially during my first 6 months in Bosavi, I headed to the forest to listen and record. I was in the care of groups of children, like you see here. Guiding my forest walks, they enjoyed the play of a simple game. I'd attach my parabolic microphone to the recorder and enclose my ears in isolating headphones. Standing in the forest, I'd point the parabolic microphone in the direction of unseeable forest birds. What followed was bursts of bemused laughter. With that, one of the children would jump up, take my forearm, fix, and anchor it. Sure enough, as they made their move, a bird was all of a sudden in sharp acoustic focus in my ears. Then, acknowledging my smile, the children would burst out laughing anew, meaning it was time for me to come up with something more challenging. What a forceful daily lesson in listening as habitus, in routinized, emplaced hearing as embodied locality. It only takes a minute, the minute you've listened to, for a 12-year-old Bosavi child to identify the 15 species of birds audible on that recording. How? What kind of sonic knowing, what kind of mastery of emplaced listening is that? Where does it come from? Whatever else they are, human histories are histories of listening, fabulously local echoacoustic ways of placemaking that come from the routine business of sensuous co-presence with what science historian Donna Haraway calls companion species. We're traveling into the forest of acustemologies, of acoustic ways of knowing, tracking orientations to the world through sound. What are the aesthetic consequences of humans and companion species making place by acoustically cohabiting the rainforest? Meet Yubi. For years, every encounter with him brought me back to a single profound question. Why were Bosavi's most prolific composers also its most accomplished ornithologists? Yubi taught me to hear acoustically adaptive knowledge as co-aesthetic recognition. He taught me how every natural historical detail had symbolic value added. Listening together to rainforest fruit doves, he first taught me how birds sound simultaneously as ancestral spirit presences and as time-space clocks. Over the years, Yubi demonstrated how the local invention of song reprises that transit with poetic texts that map avian spirit movements through the rainforest. He taught me how ceremonial dancers become spirit presences when they can be heard and seen as birds at forest waterfalls. He taught me how the streamers of a dance costume must arc and flow like a waterfall in order to resound. He taught me that the figure of a spirit bird emerges when the singer's voice and movement flows the same way. Midulahi, meet the Walu Creek, her prized Stradivarius. Like Yubi, Ulahi taught me how songs are sung in a bird's voice. That's why songs don't sing the world as experienced by travel on foot, but rather move through watercourses, following the flight paths of forest birds. Ulahi taught me how water moves through land like voice moves through the body. She taught me why song maps, like bird flight paths, follow the courses of water and never map the world the way humans experience it on foot in the forest. Over 25 years, with the help of Yubi, Ulahi, and many others, I recorded, transcribed, mapped, walked, swam, climbed, and photographed or GPS'd the paths of about 1,000 of these songs. Their texts contain almost 7,000 lexical descriptors, names of places, of flora, of fauna, of topography, as well as sensuous phonesthetic evocations of light, wind, motion, and sound qualities, particularly of birds, water, and insects. These songs constitute a poetic cartography of the Bosavi forests, literally paths, what Bosavi people call tok, mapping layered biographies of social relationships. The one you just heard maps precisely this kind of path for Ulahi, tracing a relationship with her grandmother through a map of shared waterway places and surrounding cicada and water sounds. This song, like all of the others I've come to hear and know, is inseparable from an environmental consciousness. As knowledge productions, Bosavi songs are machines for cohabitation, an archive of ecological and aesthetic coevolution. The poetics of the everyday world is vocally performed through what Bosavi people call Durugu Ganadan, literally lift up over sounding. The idea conjoins the sonic layers of alternation, overlap, and interlock that characterize the interactions of all forest sound presences with all of the ways they are met in co-present human inventions of voice, poetry, song, and dance. How to record such a reverberant world, once introduced to listening to the unique lift-up over conditions of the rainforest. After years of experiment, I learned that the best way was to always record 3 or more layers of forest height and 2 or more layers of forest depth, and to mix the sounds of the distinct interaction niches that they produce. Bringing portable mixing equipment to the forest made it possible to have consultants work with me on rough mixes, thus creating an ethno-aesthetic way both to listen and to share the ensemble of a lift-up over sounding world. For the voices of the Rainforest film soundtrack in 7.1 surround, it was even possible to add full spatial presence approximating what Ulahi was hearing around her when she was singing at the creek. Because I had recorded the stereo track of her voice at the top in green, and then 2 additional stereo heights of the forest behind her, the next 2 tracks in pink and green. Then I recorded the water to each side and behind her, the next 3 tracks in yellow, purple, and pink. And then 3 more tracks of the height layers of ambiances shifting at a distance, in orange, pink, and green. And then the distant sounds of water at the creek bank behind me, facing her, in pink at the bottom. And from all of these tracks, the possibility emerges to present not only what a singer sings, but the world she hears and participates in as she is singing it. 7.1 cinema surround sound can model not just the space of this hearing, singing, recording, and mixing process, but also the time, making it possible by measuring time delays and reflections and programming them for the sonic interaction layers. The result brings the viewer-listener directly into an experiential contact with the space and time world of the rainforest and its inhabitants. Now meet Kilia. He made Bosavi's first contact with outsiders, taking an axe from the hands of a white Australian. In Papua New Guinea's remote monolingual places like Bosavi, the local word for axe became the first term for government. Later, the idea of government was signified by the word bikmaus, big mouth, the word for shotgun in Tok Pisin, the pidgin national lingua franca. That's because a common first contact pacification ritual for remote villagers was to watch an Australian colonial officer put a shotgun to the head of a pig and blow it to pieces. Government meant the ultimate power, the ability of colonial intruders to silence with the most violent noise imaginable. In 1984, the dawn of an era of rainforest logging and mining, a newly dramatic sound emerged from the sky when a helicopter landed for the very first time in a Bosavi village. Kilia was among the first to make contact. Kilia, who did not speak Tok Pisin, nonetheless called the helicopter bikmaus. He didn't have to read Jacques Attali's Noise to understand visceral confrontation with acoustic terror. In 1956, when colonial pacification patrols arrived, his first hearing of the explosive surprise of a shotgun blast made him shudder and pee down his leg. Almost 40 years later, Kilia's grandson Odo, leader of Bosavi's then newly emergent string band music, composed a guitar song mapping helicopter flight paths into the rainforest. He named his song Nupula Bikmaus, the new shotgun. You can hear this history of listening on CDs I've recorded. 2 of them, of rainforest ambient sound walks and of interactions between sounding and singing in the forest through the course of a day and night, are completely constructed using the height and depth model of sound niches I explained. Another anthropology of sound, in sound project is the retrospective triple CD with book, chronicling 25 years of Bosavi recording encounters. The most immersive spatial surround sound version of the forest can be heard on the 7.1 film soundtrack to the Blu-ray disc in the new photo book for Voices of the Rainforest. In 2000, as logging companies made it difficult for me to return to Bosavi, Charlie Kyle, my oldest friend in music anthropology, invited me to Greek Macedonia as he, his partner Angeliki, and photographer Dick Blau were finishing Bright Balkan Morning, their book project about Romani instrumentalists. They commissioned me to create a companion CD for the book. In the course of the collaboration, Charlie and I found ourselves walking through the countryside, listening to visible and invisible cascades of sheep and goat bells. And in the mix here, listening to a herd dog's hostility overlapped by shepherd Mitsos cursing the dog's kin back to the beginnings of antiquity. That's when I began to wonder if bells might stand to 1,000 years of European village acustemologies as birds stand to thousands more in the New Guinea rainforest. That's when I began to wonder if animal bells sonified the boundaries of common and private land, and with that, sonified histories of class, of wealth, of labor, and of struggles over land ownership. That's when I began to wonder if I was listening to pastoral parallels of what was so audible in the Bosavi forests, an acustemological triangle linking sound to ecology and cosmology. In the rainforest, the sung voicing of a spirit bird's presence commands crying, a flowing of tears that merges with the waterfall sound of the costumed dancers, rattles, and streamers. Could some sort of similar logic be audible in bells, which, like rainforest birds, resound simultaneously as natural historical clocks, as place markers of the eco-social niches that define communities, and as spiritual beacons mediating heavens and earth? In the years since, numerous times walking through Italy, Greece, France, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, I've heard how, like the euro, performing the late capitalist fantasy of an integrated European economy, bells ring a common acoustic currency, a trans-country imagination of European heritage. Sensory historian Alain Corbin's book, Les Cloches de la Terre, translated in English as Village Bells, opens many lines of inquiry into ways bells mark the audibility of struggle, particularly between the church and civil authority. Imagine bell ringing as a performance that asks, who owns time? Imagine bell ringing as a performance that asks, who controls the space and time of labor? Imagine bells as the ringing of contested rights to announce the calendar of births, deaths, marriages, festivals, gatherings, and dispersals. Imagine bells as the sonic history of ambivalence over the regulation of habitual village space-time. A long art history is particularly significant here. For example, Jean-François Millet's painting, L'Angelus, relates the visual and acoustic confluence of prayer and work to the defining character of rural French class and community. In his rendering of depth, the muted and miniature church steeple is acoustically amplified outward to the looming spatial scale of peasant workers in the field. The acoustic space-time of ringing the Angelus and silent or softly vocalized praying is set against the visual space-time of the sky's hazy glow and the distance that separates the spheres of peasant work and domesticity. Alpine and pre-alpine villages in France, like the one I visited in Méaudre, are good places to hear echoes of this past in the present. Aerial postcards from the last 50 years tell bird's-eye and bell's-eared stories of interactions of church, state, agriculture, domesticity, private and public life. Walking along the roadside one summer night, I stopped to listen to belled cows grazing. After a strike of hours, the Angelus was heralded by fixed strokes of 3. Then the bell was released and sounded swinging through the valleys for almost 4 minutes. Like radio stations, bells broadcast from centers to peripheries. The limits of their signal are the limits of an acoustic community. But what does ringing the Angelus at 7 p.m. mean to cows dangling heavy brass bells around their necks? Why do they know it's time to head to the mountains? Animals are given voice and difference by bells, and humans both become and other that difference in carnival gear. Carnival disrupts civility because belled noisemaking rewrites the rules of space and of time, of who and what can or can't be heard, of who and what can or can't be controlled. In Skyros, Greece, I listened to ways carnival denaturalizes quiet and articulates struggle in and through belled noise. In the Mundus Inversus, it is the thundering of bells that most often renders impossible ordinary hearing and speaking. As for becoming, take a story from Mamoida, Sardinia, the home of Susurtu, a well-known quartet of singers who perform canto a tenore, the unique Sardinian polyphonic vocal style. Susurtu's lead and solo voice, the bokeh, and the second voice, the mezzu bokeh, sing in the high, tense, resonant style well known in the Mediterranean. The next voice, contra, and the lowest voice, basu, sing with a unique timbre, at once bell brassy, sheep raspy, and goat guttural. We've had years of meticulous research and recordings of canto a tenore. But why is the singing rarely presented the way shepherds often hear it, with belled sheep in the immediate background? I wondered if this absence signaled that there was something culturally awkward about presenting the tenores singing with their sheep. So I asked my research assistant to inquire privately, in the local language, what the group thought of my idea to mix their voices with those of their animals. A few moments later, Mario, the group leader, the guy who looks like he could be my brother, turned to me and went, "Meh." I took that to mean no problem. So, the world sonified is the world known, the world felt, the world performed. Belled sound is a way of knowing the world because its sources, its agents, and its audiences are listening to the production and reproduction of categories, listening to the ordering of things in 10 centuries of European pastoral histories. Imagine Michel Foucault, the great theorist of institutional power, lecturing on how bells govern time through the authority of space. Imagine Mikhail Bakhtin, the great theorist of the carnivalesque, reminding him how bells disrupt space through the time of noise. Imagine me, clochando, listening to them in stereo. Imagine Foucault detailing how bells discipline space through the time of domestication. Imagine Bakhtin reminding him how bells obliterate time through the space of the carnivalesque. Imagine me, clochando, listening to them in stereo. Imagine Foucault insisting on how church bells order the time of work by marking the spatiality of prayer. Imagine Bakhtin reminding him to listen to belled cows grazing. Imagine me, clochando, listening to them in stereo. I wonder if this has anything to do with why Henri Magritte titled his ear bell collage La leçon de musique, the music lesson, or why his upside-down music man stands on a pedestal called Le Savoir. It is this kind of stereo listening to power and disruption that informs the making of audio essays in my CD and DVD series, The Time of Bells. I traveled to Accra, Ghana, after my first 4 years of listening to European bells. The idea was to pause from the campanological curiosities of the old world to check out how local musicians and blacksmiths might present a contemporary yet much older world perspective on bells in a place where they are known as the keepers of musical timelines for drummers and dancers. But before I heard a single bell or met a single musician or blacksmith in Accra, I encountered a different chronotopic index of terrific acoustic presence. The very late night croaking by common toads, Bufo regularis. Emanating from 2-foot-deep concrete sewers flanking city roads, the toads' voices are intensely amplified by the cement walls of their fetid amphitheaters, the ratcheting sounds broadcast far and wide. Recording these sounds, my mind raced ahead to the possibility that I could someday play them back locally to open a conversation about sensing place in Accra's urban acustemology. Later on that visit, I also met percussionist Niotu Anand and heard him play avant-garde Afro-jazz with multi-instrumentalist Ninoy Norte. 6 months later, I excitedly returned to Accra to study bells with Niotu and to record his and Ninoy's tribute to John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. When I returned the next year to play with the band and resume lessons with Niotu, I asked his impressions of my Bufo recordings. As he took his headphones off, he spoke a short but revelatory statement. "You hear, Prof? It's like what I've been showing you in our music. The crickets are sounding like the bell, with very strict time, and the kokodeni are the master drummers, making many rhythms that cross on top and sit below." Crossing on top, sitting below, how might the metaphoric space-time concepts that Niotu uttered be shaping forces of a musical imagination? I proposed that we collaborate on an experiment in listening and feedback. Niotu listened to a 6-minute-long toadscape I assembled. Overdubbing distinct variations on 10 instrument sets, we then recorded Niotu's interactive musical responses to the toads as rhythmic interlocutors. Then we removed the toads from the mix to study how Niotu variously uses the toads as a metronomic click track and calculator, how his overdubs feed back the polyrhythmic math of simultaneously hearing in patterns of 3 against 2, 4 against 3, and 6 against 4. This led to the collaborative CD Buffo Variations. Here's a moment of Niotu's listening in acustemology, feeding back the crossing on top and sitting below space-time of cricket-toad interplays as he performs on gangaphone, an instrument he invented from multiple gankoki double bells. Toads and roadside gutters first got me listening to Accra's street life, but it was car horns that hooked me on the chronotope of the road. Pon-pon is the phonesthetic name of the squeeze bulb klaxon truck horn and the sound it introduced to Ghana and its colonial Bedford, Austin, Oxford, and Morris vehicles in the late 1930s. Brought by traders from India, the horns were attached to wooden lorries that transported passengers, trucked goods, and opened up the timber and market roads in the colonial Gold Coast, and then in independent Ghana in the 1940s, the 1950s, and 1960s. In the township of La, one of the 7 Accra residential areas of the Ga-speaking people, the city's original inhabitants, something unique happened with the coming of electric horns. The La drivers took the old pon-pon klaxon horns off of their vehicles, replaced the worn rubber with ultra-flexible, oversized enema bulbs, and developed a honking and hocketing squeeze bulb horn music with the addition of flutes, bells, shakers, drums, and wrenches on tire rims. The joyfulness of the honk horn music relates to the band's raison d'être. The drivers only perform this pon-pon honking horn music at funerals for their departed Union colleagues. And here's where the Black Atlantic connection is revealed, to the Rejoice When You Die New Orleans jazz funeral. Distinguished drivers are buried in wooden replicas of their vehicles. And in law, the driver's road to heaven is paved by road songs and the sounds of car horns parading through the streets, with community participation marked by dancers of the second line. On these CDs, you'll hear how Pawpaw sounds a multi-layered story of regional history, colonialism, the diaspora, and globalization. In the context of Ghanaian indigenous music history, the Hocketing horn sound derives from mensong, the multi-part animal horn ensemble music of Akan origin. Later, there's a clear articulation with brass band music, indigenized from colonial origins to become central to the sound of highlife and combo jazz. Animal horn to trumpet horn to honk horn, pawpaw music connects two critical dimensions of African urban modernities: motor vehicles and popular music, critical media of the cosmopolitan imagination. This story is also revealed in these Pawpaw DVDs and photo book, following the funeral for a beloved Pawpaw band member, listening to 25 elder drivers explain how lorry honk horns became sacralized musical instruments, and hearing how vehicles and horns voice memory and reputation. So there are 4 acustemological triangles connecting sound, ecology, and cosmology. And the sum of them makes me ask why the dynamism of sound is so magnetized to histories of movement and transport. Forest flyways, pastoral pathways, city gutters, and horn-honked roads. Why does sound do so much of the work that grounds and transports and mixes humans and companion species? Birds, bells, toads, car horns. Listening to histories of listening and tangling like this, I ask, what are they, if not historical clocks of the longue durée? What are they, if not collaborative teaching technologies for the production of cohabitation and time-space consciousness? What are they, if not species and materials that audibly fuse the here, there, and where of sounds with their now, then, and when? What are they, if not acoustemic resonators, sensuously articulating the materiality and sociality of sound in memory, nostalgia, desire, reverie, trauma, and transport? What are they, if not figures of acustemological triangulation, where sounding and listening point to and from ecology and cosmology? What are they, if not multivalent signs of regulatory tension, figuring sound in histories of authority versus disruption, contestation versus naturalization, noise versus pleasure, emplacement and displacement. And what are they, if not histories of local listeners as indigenous acoustic historians and archivists? It is the spirit of those questions that summarizes my 45 years of listening to histories of listening among Papua New Guineans and their rainforest birds, among European villagers and their local bells, and among West African urban toads and drummers, drivers, pedestrians, and honking horns. And with this listening, a politics and an aesthetics of recording to present anthropologies of sound in sound, and to fuse acoustics with epistemology to propose the study of sound as a way of knowing the world.
É isso, estamos aqui retornando dessa bela apresentação, muito, que nos faz refletir muito. Deixa eu só retornar. Estamos aqui, podemos voltar a abrir câmeras e também começar uma conversa com o professor Steve. Então, quem quiser se inscrever, Felipe está aqui, estamos aqui e abertos a começar a conversa. Eu acho que vamos começar com você mesmo, Wagner. Então, só lembrando que vamos fazer as perguntas em português, ou nos inscrevermos, ou pedindo para se inscrever, e Luiz fará a tradução consecutiva.
Eu começo? Tá bom. Então, Luiz, eu vou fazer Vou quebrar o gelo, na verdade. Começar aqui a fazer a primeira pergunta para motivar as pessoas a participarem, a dialogarem. E vou perguntar o seguinte, Luiz. Primeiro, agradecer ao Steve a generosidade de nos conceder esse material brilhante, maravilhoso, da trajetória dele, de pesquisa. E só uma provocação para a gente começar a discussão. No final da aula, da videoaula, Steve comenta que, enfim, o trabalho dele de criação, documentação e pesquisa através, sobre, com o som, tem uma dimensão política também. Então, eu traria para o debate que Steve pudesse nos apontar um pouco algumas reflexões sobre o caráter político do trabalho com arte, estética, na antropologia, enfim, na etnografia. Obrigado.
Okay, so I will now translate the question into English. The question was by Professor Wagner Chaves. And let me just find where I wrote it. Right. He said he's going to break the ice, and he thanks Steve for his generosity and for showing us all this wonderful material and all this incredible biography. And he begins with a provocation just to get the ball rolling. he comments that at the end, Steve mentions that his work in creating, documenting, and researching by way of sound has a political dimension as well. And he asks Steve to reflect and to maybe weave some comments on the political character of work with art and aesthetics and anthropology and ethnography.
How many weeks do I have to answer that question, Wagner? It's a wonderful question, and of course, I'm sure it's as important to all of you as it is to me. I experience many kinds of political dimensions to the work I do. One dimension that is very political in a place like West Africa is the dimension of collaboration through media, both to raise the international profile of African musicians and to make work that is useful to them, both in their local situation and in their larger world situation. And so exposing the virtuosity of African musicians in areas outside of something called tradition is very important to a generation of African musicians who feel that the term tradition is as bad as the term primitive. That the term tradition is like prison. That the term tradition is a way of forcing them to live in the past. I can use the word avant-garde, you can use the word avant-garde, but the important thing is they are musicians and they want to be recognized as being in dialogue with other musicians and with a world of sound. And we can call them experimental, we can call them avant-garde, but what they don't want to be called is traditional, even though they are masters of those things, masters of that knowledge, because they know that that word is largely used to oppress them and to lock them into a container and not allow them to be contemporary and not allow them to be coeval and not allow them to be called experimental or to really go beyond the local. So the projects I do with African musicians are very political in the way they reach beyond, they express this desire to force people around the world to understand that African musicians are not just masters of traditions. Luis, I think that's more than enough for you to try to express.
That's great, Steven. Bom, o Steven responde, primeiro ele pergunta quantas semanas ele tem para responder essa pergunta, né, que é uma pergunta complexa em muitos níveis. Acho que é uma pergunta maravilhosa e que ela é importante para todos nós, que é tão importante para ele quanto para nós, certamente. E ele diz que ele experimenta muitos tipos das dimensões políticas no trabalho dele. E uma dimensão, um exemplo que ele pega, que é uma dimensão que é muito importante, uma dimensão política muito importante na África Ocidental, por exemplo, é a dimensão colaborativa, né, por meio da mídia, visando dar projeção internacional aos músicos africanos, fazer um trabalho que seja útil para eles, não só para a arte deles, mas para a vida deles, para a política deles também. Então, expondo a virtuosidade da música africana, que vai além de algo que a gente possa chamar de tradição. Isso é muito importante lá, onde para as pessoas com quem o Steven trabalha, a tradição é vista como tão ruim quanto o termo primitivo, né? Visto como uma prisão, algo que os mantém no passado. Né? E a gente pode, diz o Steven, falar em avant-garde, mas o fato é que eles são músicos e querem ser reconhecidos como músicos. O que eles não querem é ser taxados de tradicional, apesar de também serem mestres desse conhecimento tradicional, pois sabem que essa palavra os prende, joga nos passado e inibe que se chame eles de experimentais, né? Que eles transcendam o local. Então, os projetos que ele faz com músicos africanos são muito políticos, justamente por visarem dar essa exposição, ir além do local e revelar esse desejo que eles têm de serem considerados músicos, e não músicos tradicionais. I think that's about right.
And I would only add that making films and making CDs, which I did for several years, 8 years actually, before writing a book about Accra, was a way of establishing the strength and importance of my willingness to do what was most important to the musicians. Of course, I could have written a book earlier, but they wanted their work, they wanted to be well paid, they wanted their work represented in CDs and in audio and installations, and they wanted their histories to be taken seriously. The truck drivers are not professional musicians. They're professional truck drivers in a truck driving union. And they felt very strongly that a CD of their music would make it clear how serious the work of being a musical undertaker is. They were shocked when I was able to get the Smithsonian Institution in the US to fund that first CD ever of their music as a gift to Ghana from the United States for the 50th anniversary of Ghana's independence in 2007. And this was a way of also acknowledging them and creating a series of programs where we've tried to connect them through movies and images and sounds with musicians from New Orleans who perform in jazz funerals. To create an artificial historical connection between the two, but to take that shock of recognition between what they're doing in Ghana and what people are doing in New Orleans, and explore the way in which the institution of parades and sounds and the power of sound and music to memorialize, to honor and remember people in certain professions, to follow their road, the importance of that kind of thing. So in each one of the projects, there's been a politics of connection, a politics of amplification, a politics that is related to the conditions of labor and work in Accra and getting money and reputation to people there. And all of that was established long before I wrote a word or published anything in text. So that's an example of how the media of sound can forge forms of political alliance that work toward helping to achieve perhaps something in the direction of some musical equity or some kind of musical respect across very far-reaching lines.
Ok, thank you, Steven. Então, o Steven diz que ele passou muito tempo, 8 anos, na verdade, fazendo filmes e CDs, antes dele escrever uma palavra sequer, um livro sobre Accra. Isso foi um meio de estabelecer a força e a importância da vontade dos amigos dele em Accra, né, de fazer o que era mais importante para eles próprios, para os músicos. Ele podia ter escrito um livro muito antes, mas os músicos queriam ser pagos, eles queriam que o som deles fossem gravados em CDs e assim por diante. E os motoristas de ônibus, de caminhão com que ele trabalhou, não são músicos, na verdade são motoristas de caminhão que fazem parte de um sindicato. E eles achavam que um CD mostraria como é sério também o trabalho com música que eles fazem. E eles se chocaram quando o Smithsonian financiou o CD. Foi um presente dos Estados Unidos para Gana no aniversário da independência de Gana. E foi um meio também de dar reconhecimento a eles, criar programas que os conectam por meio de filmes, sons, etc., com músicos em Nova Orleans que trabalham também em blocos, né, em funerais. A ideia, claro, não é criar uma espécie de genealogia simples entre Nova Orleans e Gana, mas justapor o que se faz nos dois lugares e explorar como paradas e sons, o poder da música e o som para lembrar pessoas e rememorar pessoas se expressa e como é importante. Então, em cada projeto, portanto, dele, tinha uma política de conexão, de amplificação, relacionada às condições de trabalho em Accra, a necessidade de arrumar dinheiro, de respeitar a reputação das pessoas lá. E tudo isso se estabeleceu antes dele publicar uma palavra sequer. Então, esse é um exemplo de como a mídia do som pode criar formas de aliança política que fazem ou ajudam a fazer algo como igualdade musical, ou pelo menos a gerar algum tipo de respeito musical.
The last thing, just very briefly, about the New Guinea project that I did, the Voices of the Rainforest with Mickey Hart. That one has sold 50,000 copies, which I believe is quite unique for a recording of indigenous song or environment. And all of that money has gone back to Papua New Guinea, where we have lawyers working with and for the Bosavi people, doing things that I cannot do. We have been able to keep logging, mining, oil, and extractive resources out of the rainforest with lawsuits and other things that cost a lot of money. As a result of the financial success of that CD. So there's also, aside from the politics of amplification and creating a collaboration between an indigenous people, a rock star, and a researcher, there we have the project of using the money for the indigenous agenda of retaining environmental autonomy and control. So that's a different kind of political project that I've been involved in. And now the film is doing even more of that. Sections of the film were shown every night during the Grateful Dead concerts of the last tour. That means that 30 different audiences around the US, each 25 to 35,000 people, saw pieces of this film every night. The amount of money that has come in from the Deadhead community and the sales of the project have again escalated tremendously. So I'm trying to create a different kind of financial model for the collaboration between researchers, indigenous communities, and the possibility of using the tools of the popular culture world. And yes, it is a privilege to work with George Lucas and with the Grateful Dead. And some people are very suspicious of me and have been extremely critical of me for this kind of collaboration with these people over the years. Some people see George Lucas and Mickey Hart as devils, and personally, I don't. I have seen what their generosity and compassion and political solidarity means. But that's another example, you know, about the politics of media. Going back to the original question, what's the politics of working doing the anthropology of sound in sound, or investing in the politics of media.
Então, ele agora, uma última coisa, ele diz, falando do trabalho dele na Papua Nova Guiné e do Vozes da Floresta que ele fez com o Mickey Hart, esse CD vendeu 50 mil cópias, o que é singular, talvez seja único para uma gravação de músicas indígenas e sons do ambiente, e todo o dinheiro desse CD voltou para Papua Nova Guiné, onde tem grupos de advogados que trabalham para os Boçavi. E o Steve diz que conseguiu manter, junto com esse dinheiro, em parte, conseguiu manter a mineração, os madeireiros, etc., fora da floresta, proteger o meio ambiente lá, por meio de processos que, claro, custam dinheiro, e tudo isso foi financiado por vendas do CD. Então, além da política de amplificação e a colaboração, tem a colaboração entre uma estrela do rock, um pesquisador, os povos indígenas, onde o dinheiro gerado é usado a favor da autonomia dos povos que fazem os sons, né, dos povos indígenas. Então, esse é outro tipo de projeto político em que ele participou. E agora o filme faz o mesmo, né? Parte do filme tem sido mostrado nos shows do Grateful Dead no último tour, ou seja, muita gente viu esse filme, muito dinheiro da comunidade dos Deadheads foi repassada para Papua Nova Guiné. E o Steve diz que ele busca, então, criar um novo modelo de financiamento e colaboração entre pesquisadores, músicos, etc. E é um privilégio trabalhar com gente como George Lucas, como Grateful Dead, mas muitos colegas, eu imagino, levantam suspeitas e críticas e veem o George Lucas e o Mickey Hart como demônios. Mas o Steve diz que viu a generosidade, a compaixão e a solidariedade política deles. Isso, então, é mais um exemplo de como a política permeia a antropologia do som.
Professora Rose?
Oi. Vou falar em inglês com ele, tá? Pode ser? Aí ele faz a tradução ao contrário. Ok?
Seria legal fazer em português. Desculpa, a gente tinha combinado isso para poder coletivizar a pergunta para todos. É possível disso?
Tá
Rose,
bom.
você pode fazer em português e depois em inglês.
E depois você traduz, pode ser também. Pode ser.
Tá bom. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Steven, for today and also for last week in Enabed. You've been a lot in Brazil in these last 2 weeks. I will make the question in Portuguese. Nós trabalhamos, eu e o meu companheiro Jasper Shawcraft, com músicos africanos que migraram para São Paulo nos últimos anos. Eles vêm de Moçambique, República Democrática do Congo, Senegal, Togo, Angola. E a gente tem pensado bastante sobre a música na diáspora, e a gente também está interessado nas políticas do som e do fazer musical, soundmaking, né? A gente queria saber se você conhece exemplos de músicos para quem a tradição não é uma prisão, mas sim uma forma de agência ou mesmo um capital transcultural, transcultural capital. A gente tem trabalhado com essas dimensões, com esses músicos da diáspora africana em São Paulo, e queria saber, então, como pensar no potencial, no poder político do uso da tradição por esses músicos, sobretudo, né, no nosso caso, com os músicos na diáspora. Quer que eu faça em inglês direto?
Como você preferir, pode fazer, Rose.
Tá bom, obrigada. Então, so, Steven, me and Jasper Shawcraft, we work with African musicians that have migrated to São Paulo in the last few years, like 7, 8 years. They migrate from Mozambique, DRC, Senegal, Togo, Angola, and we wonder about music in the diaspora. We are also interested in the politics of sound and sound making, and we wanted to know if you know examples of musicians for whom tradition is not a prison, as you mentioned, but a source of agency or transcultural capital. And to understand if tradition can be also considered a way of political power in the use that these musicians make of tradition in the diaspora, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, myself I think the word tradition is a complicated word, and it has as much positive possibility as it has negative possibility. In Accra, I became sensitive to the way that word was used to constrain or to hold back certain kinds of music and musicians. And I listened to people say that the government, that cultural agencies, that museums, and that foreigners wanted tradition because they thought tradition is something that could be controlled. They could buy it and they could sell it as an authentic image of Ghana. But for a Ghanaian musician who plays reggae or a Ghanaian musician who plays jazz, they feel that they will always be judged as inauthentic because they are Ghanaian. So I wrote about the desire to be cosmopolitan and the desire to experience an expansive sense of agency, a sense of agency beyond things very immediate to one's control and projection. And but even though I acknowledge the importance of cosmopolitan agency in this project and book about Accra, I'm very aware that tradition is very powerful and a very important part of agency and transcultural and transnational capital for many musicians. The ability to teach, the ability to transmit, and the ability to participate in international musical conversation through tradition, it's something that is unquestionably important for us to experience. I had that attitude, and perhaps I assumed that everybody did, and that was the thing that was shocking when I went to Accra, to experience musicians saying, yes, we came up with all those skills, but we don't want to talk about tradition. We want to talk about John Coltrane. We want to talk about jazz. We want to talk about New Orleans. We want to talk about, being just musicians, not Ghanaian musicians, but just be musicians.
Bom, Steven diz, claro que ele acha que a palavra tradição é complicada, que tem possibilidades positivas e possibilidades negativas. Em Accra, ele teve que se sensibilizar do modo como a palavra era usada para constranger ou amarrar certos músicos e músicas, né? Então, as pessoas em Accra diziam que os governos, as agências culturais, os estrangeiros, eles queriam tradição. Eles imaginavam que tradição podia ser controlada, né, como uma imagem autêntica de Ghana. Mas o músico ganense que toca reggae ou jazz acaba sendo considerado inautêntico. E o Steven escreveu sobre esse desejo, essa vontade de se criar um sentido expansivo de agência. Mas, apesar dele reconhecer a importância dessa agência cosmopolita, ele sabe que a tradição também é muito poderosa, e que a tradição é a parte importante da agência transnacional e do capital transnacional de muitos músicos, né? A possibilidade de muitos músicos participarem de conversas musicais internacionais, de eventos internacionais, muitas vezes está ancorada numa noção de tradição. Também, então, tem uma importância transcontextual aí. E o Steve diz que ele tinha essa atitude, e ele achava que todos tinham, e ele se chocou quando viu músicos em Gana dizendo, sim, esses talentos, essas músicas, elas vêm daqui, nós a inventamos, mas nós não queremos falar de tradição, queremos falar de John Coltrane, de jazz, de Nova Orleans, etc.
Vamos lá, mais alguma inscrição? Aqui veio uma pergunta. Vou te mandar, tá, Luiz? Do Siddhartha. Mas acho que, enquanto isso, eu posso, de repente, fazer uma pergunta. Pode ser, enquanto o Luiz recebe a pergunta do Siddhartha? Eu queria fazer uma pergunta em relação me parece que existe uma interdependência entre as formas de colaboração da sua pesquisa, que você estabeleceu na sua pesquisa, com uma noção que você já elabora lá no Sound and Sentiment, que é o de coestética. Então, eu queria, de repente, se o Steve pudesse falar um pouco sobre isso, né? Elaborar um pouco sobre essa relação entre os modos com que ele vem colaborando, né, com os seus interlocutores e com todo esse mundo com que ele interage, tanto de Gana quanto da Papua Nova Guiné, com essa noção de coestética. Se ele pudesse delinear assim, para a gente, né, como é que ele define essa noção de coestética, seria interessante. Acho que está fechado, Luiz.
Desculpa, é que eu fico escrevendo, acho que aí fica aparecendo o som. Right, Steve, Felipe is asking, well, he reckons there's an interdependence in the ways and how you speak of collaboration in your research with the notion that you develop in the sound and sentiment of co-aesthetics. And he wants to know about the relationship between forms of collaboration, forms of relating with your interlocutors, both in Ghana and elsewhere, in Papua New Guinea, for example, with this notion of co-aesthetics and how you would define it in terms of what you've just said.
Steve?
Yes, I'm very sorry. I had somebody at the door.
No, do you want Luis to repeat the question? Would you?
Yes, I didn't hear the translation.
Okay,
so I'm
right.
My apologies, Felipe and Luis, if you could.
Don't worry.
No problem. It's all written down. Right, Felipe asks, he reckons there's an interdependence or possibly an interdependence in what you're saying about collaboration and the place of collaboration in your research with the notion of co-aesthetics that you develop in sound and sentiment. And he wonders about this relationship between how you collaborate, of how you relate with your interlocutors in Ghana and elsewhere, in Papua New Guinea, for example, with this notion of co-aesthetics and how you would define it in terms of what you've just told us now.
That is a great comment and question, Felipe. Thank you so much. You know, I see this work as experimental, not as a work that has a fixed method or a fixed or a single desired outcome. There are so many different outcomes. And so at the one level, the collaborative and co-aesthetic is simply at the level of the personal experience of what it means to both work with people and develop lasting or enduring friendship and a sense of reciprocity and obligation and relationship with them. In New Guinea, the longer you are involved with people, the more you need to acknowledge the relationship. You have to renew relationships and acknowledge them because relationship is the foundation of everything in New Guinea. So when you spend long periods of time to learn a language or to learn, you know, what people want and desire and how you can work together to achieve those things, you become more implicated in not just their past, but also their future. And so after more than 45 years now, the people in New Guinea have constantly make requests from me. And I'm not just talking about requests for material things, but I think those requests are also about their understanding of the collaboration and the co-aesthetic. The sense that the co-aesthetic is about me being an agent in their quest to produce a certain kind of feeling or a certain kind of understanding in the world about the way they are in their place and how they wish that to be represented. So the co-aesthetic for me started as something that was perhaps very abstract, and now it's really impossible for me to separate the co-aesthetic from the very profound nature of relationship and what in New Guinea is called you me, you know, you and me, you me, the way in which there is you and there's me, but then there's also you me, the whole notion of us two. In New Guinea, there's a linguistic separation between speaking about just the two of us and us in the larger sense. But the you me is always the central bond, and you know, you go through life making all of these you me's, and this is what is also very co-aesthetic. The way you come to understand that what you produce in the way of knowledge also needs to reflect and adequately represent the spirit in which the knowledge was transferred. And that is itself an aesthetic process. I've tried to find words, and I can't, to express the way in which over the years politics and aesthetics have not continued to become interrelated for me in New Guinea, particularly around the notion of collaboration. But if it started with the idea of the co-aesthetic, then certainly the idea of the collaborative is the best way to express now what I feel is most central to what I'm doing there. Whether you call it research or you call it friendship.
Ok. Então, estão me ouvindo, então, né? O Steve, então, bom, excelente pergunta, agradece ao Felipe, excelente pergunta e comentário, né? Ele diz que vê esse trabalho como sendo experimental, então não como um trabalho que tem um método fixo ou uma finalidade fixa ou mesmo desejada. Tem muitas finalidades. Então, em um certo nível, no nível da experiência pessoal, o coestético e a colaboração, eles têm a ver com trabalhar com pessoas, com criar amizades duradouras, com reciprocidade, etc. E na Papua Nova Guiné, quanto mais você se envolve com pessoas, mais você precisa reconhecer e renovar as relações, pois a relação é a fundação de tudo na Papua Nova Guiné. Então, se você gasta muito tempo aprendendo uma língua, aprendendo o que as pessoas querem, o que elas desejam, você também se faz implicado não só no passado das pessoas, mas também no futuro delas. E há mais de 45 anos, diz o Steve, eles demandam coisas dele, né? E não só coisas materiais, é claro, mas também colaboração. E a sua compreensão da colaboração e da coestética. E ele, Steve, é um agente na busca deles, né, das pessoas da Papua Nova Guiné, por um certo tipo de sentimento ou compreensão do mundo, e de como eles querem que esse sentimento, essa compreensão, seja representada. Então, o coestético iniciou, para eles, se apresentou no início como algo muito abstrato, mas hoje é impossível separar o coestético da natureza profunda da relação, daquilo que na Papua Nova Guiné eles chamam de you-me, né? Você e eu. Tem eu, tem você e tem o você e eu. Né? E a língua boçável, imagina, tem um eu e você, que inclui só eu e você, exclui o resto, e outro que inclui nós todos, de modo geral. E durante a vida você cria vários você, eu, né? You, me. O que é coestética? E aí você passa a entender que o que você produz como conhecimento tem que representar o espírito no qual esse conhecimento lhe foi transmitido. O Steven diz que não consegue expressar em palavras, ele tenta, mas não consegue, o quanto a política e a estética seguem se imbricando, né, na vida dele. E particularmente hoje com a ideia da colaboração. Então, se começou com o coestético, a colaboração hoje é central ao que ele está fazendo, seja na pesquisa, seja na amizade.
Eu acho que a gente pode passar para a pergunta do Siddhartha e depois a Antônia se inscreveu. A Antônia vai fazer a pergunta diretamente. Obrigado.
Quem que eu faço primeiro? Desculpa, que você me mandou, Felipe?
A do Siddhartha, que eu te mandei pela mensagem.
Okay, Steven. Siddhartha would like to know how acustemology, is that a word? Acustemologia can be used in practice to recognize unequal forces of sonic power, of sound, as in the case of how world music is appropriated, or how evangelical music is appropriated by the Bosavi. Is that right? Does that make sense?
Sim, total.
Arrasou, Luiz. Obrigado.
Nada.
Yes. I think that if we accept the idea that sound is a way of knowing, then we have to ask questions about what is known, what is visible and what is known, what is invisible and what is known, how does knowledge circulate, and how the circulation of knowledge is related to the circulation of power. So in the question of world music, using the quote marks around it to indicate it as a commercial term and industry label. I think that acustemology is useful in mapping different kinds of ways to follow the money, follow the interest, follow the cultivation of tropes of desire, follow the cultivation of ways that people listen and listen for inspiration, the ways that inspiration becomes adaptation, the ways adaptation become appropriation, the way something that is just over there all of a sudden becomes the idea that you can make that your own. Something that belongs to somebody else or that originates with somebody else can somehow become intimate or can become something that is known or felt or operated on by you. You know, when Brian Eno says, I love Arabic music. I love Arabic music. Well, he can say, I love Arabic music all day, and he often does. But then, okay, well, what have you done with Arabic music to show your love? Well, he's turned it into pieces of property that make money for him. So is that an example of an acustemological process? Yes, of course. The idea of love, the idea of loving something else, I mean, it's about a confusion between the ego and the love object. The idea that the love object can completely become the ego. If you say you love something, does that mean you can steal it? Or does that mean you can profit from it? Does that mean that you can circulate it under your name? I mean, there's a way in which many different kinds of industrial processes get transferred, and their powers get transferred, or the imagination of their power gets transferred because of ideas like love, like desire. It seems to me that the whole world music business is a kind of replay of exactly what Freud wrote about in Civilization and Its Discontents, the way in which multiple kinds of confusions about difference and distance lead to a process of an even greater confusion like this one between this confusion between the ego and the love object. So you could imagine from an acustemological point of view that the world is a floating set of not just signifiers, but a floating set of love objects, acoustical love objects. And when those love objects become magnetized to powerful forces of recomposition and retransformation, histories of listening can become effaced, diluted, rewritten, and that's when something that becomes so profoundly connected to the identity of one place all of a sudden becomes, refashioned as the identity of a pop star, or refashioned as the identity, as something that can travel in a new way. If musicians from the West, like Steve Reich, can go and spend a semester in Ghana as students and sit at the feet of Ghanaian musicians and notate all of their rhythms, and then take all of those notations and reform them into something called avant-garde composition, is that not a history of listening that is transformed into a new history? You're putting a new name on a history of listening, right? You're taking Ghanaian, you're taking the 34 major rhythm packages of the Ghanaian, the tropes of timeline, and you're transforming them into things that can morph and work in different kinds of cycles, and you're stripping out the complexity of them, and so now they're now marketed under the term minimalism. That's the way in which one history of listening becomes another history of listening, and the second history of listening becomes a history of production, which gets associated with a center of power, which is European avant-garde classical music, and the production, and Steve Reich being celebrated as a unique creator, rather, and how it gets erased that the semester he spent at the University of Ghana, with his notepad and his very well trained ears for transcribing or notating particular rhythms, all of a sudden became something else. It was no longer Ghanaian rhythms. It was no longer these building blocks of traditional song dance forms, but the building blocks of avant-garde classical music. I could give you many examples, whether in the world of classical or pop or jazz or other sorts of things, but these are listening histories that that move across spaces. And I'm not trying to just say that they all have negative valences. John Coltrane listened to the Shehnai and the Nagaswara in the double reed Indian North and South India instruments, and it just happened to be that while he was listening to those records, a very popular musical in America, and film, that he took his kids to, had a song in it called My Favorite Things. And when John Coltrane played My Favorite Things on soprano saxophone, and brought together a particular sound of modality, nasality, North and South Asian double reed instruments, jazz sonorities, and modal substitutions for chord changes and so forth. You have other kinds of very powerful examples of the transformation of histories of listening into histories of new ways to listen or new ways to imagine. So the so-called world music story, you know, has to be understood in multiple ways, and you know, and obviously I would want to write about and think about acustemology differently in the case of Brian Eno and Arabic music, and Steve Reich and Ghanaian music, and John Coltrane and double reed instruments and the soprano saxophone, and the extended use of the Mixolydian and Dorian and Locrian modes in relation to, you know, Western song form chord changes.
Okay, I'm going to do my best here. Bom, você falou que ele acha que se a gente aceitar a ideia de que o som é um modo de conhecer, a gente tem que se perguntar sobre o que se sabe, né? E o que não se sabe, o que é visível e o que se sabe, o que é invisível e o que se sabe, como o conhecimento circula e como isso se relaciona com a circulação do poder. Então, no caso do world music, com aspas, né, porque é um termo da indústria, a acustemologia é útil para que a gente possa mapear os caminhos, né, por quais o dinheiro circula, os interesses circulam, o cultivo de modos que as pessoas escutam e como eles escutam a inspiração e os meios como a inspiração vira adaptação. Isso a gente traça como algo que está ali e vira a ideia de que isso pode ser seu, né? Pertence ao outro, origina em outro, mas pode virar íntimo, pode virar algo que é conhecido, que é sentido, que é operado por você. Então, quando Brian Eno diz que ele ama a música árabe, e ele diz isso muito, a pergunta que o Steve faz é, bom, o que você faz com isso? Né? O que você faz com esse amor? Como é que você mostra esse amor? Bom, ele transformou isso em uma propriedade que lhe dá dinheiro. Isso é um exemplo da acustemologia, que é uma confusão entre o ego e o objeto do amor, né? De que o objeto do amor vira o ego. Se você ama algo, você pode roubar esse algo, você pode lucrar com esse algo, ele circula, ele pode circular em seu nome. Então, os poderes de processos criativos é transferidos por causa de ideias como amor ou desejo, né? O mundo do business da música é um replay, né, do que o Freud escreveu sobre como certos tipos de confusão sobre diferença e distância criam mais confusão, né, como essa, onde o ego e o objeto do amor se confundem. Então, da perspectiva acustemológica, o mundo é um conjunto não só de significantes flutuantes, mas de objetos de amor que se magnetizam a forças poderosas que acabam por apagar histórias de escuta, né? Histórias de escutar, reescreve essas histórias. Isso é algo que é profundamente ligado à identidade de um lugar, é refeito, né? Recriado como a identidade da estrela pop, ou como algo que pode viajar em um meio novo. Se os músicos ocidentais, como Steve Reich, podem ir passar um semestre em Gana, né, na Universidade de Gana, e aprender tudo com os músicos locais, anotar tudo, levar tudo e recriar isso como avant-garde, bom, a gente não tem aqui um exemplo da transformação de uma história de escuta, né? Ele pega todos os 34 principais ritmos de Gana e transforma isso em coisas que participam em novos círculos. E ele tira essa complexidade e transforma num marketing, né? Marketeia como minimalismo. Então, uma história complexa de escuta se torna um produto que está ligado aos centros de poder. E Steve Reich é celebrado como um criador singular, e o que é apagado justamente esse semestre em que ele passou na Universidade de Gana, anotando tudo, com seu ouvido muito hábil para anotar, tudo isso vira algo diferente. Não é mais o ritmo ganense, não são mais as formas de dança e música locais, mas agora são blocos da construção de uma música que ele vende como avant-garde. E tem muitos exemplos disso, mas aqui são histórias de escuta que se movem pelo espaço. E nem tudo é negativo. Ele pega o exemplo do John Coltrane, eu perdi um pouco os detalhes do que ele falou, mas com certas músicas indianas, que enquanto ele ouvia essas músicas, ele também levou os seus filhos ao musical muito popular na época, nos Estados Unidos, onde tinha a música My Favorite Things, que ele depois tocou no sax soprano, trouxe uma modalidade, usando uma modalidade nasal do norte e do sul da Ásia, misturou com sonoridades do jazz, substituições modais, etc. Esse é um exemplo poderoso da transformação de uma história de escuta em novos meios de escuta. Então, world music, ele diz, tem que ser compreendido de muitas maneiras. É claro que o Brian Eno e a música árabe, o Steve Reich e a música ganense, e o Coltrane e a música indiana, nem tudo é igual também. Mais ou menos isso.
Agora nós temos uma pergunta da Antônia. Acho que
Me
não tem mais
escutam?
tempo. Sim, Antônia.
Desculpa, minha voz que eu estou muito doente,
Tudo
mas
bem.
não é Covid.
Ainda bem.
Já fiz o teste. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta relacionada àquela questão que ele estava colocando sobre o método colaborativo e experimental, né? E se ele, de alguma forma, relaciona esse método dele, né, próprio dele, a uma antropologia que vem sendo chamada, principalmente nos Estados Unidos, de antropologia engajada, pelo Stuart Kish, por exemplo, ou etnografia militante, pelo Jeffrey Juris, por exemplo, seria um outro exemplo, né? Se ele faz alguma correlação entre esses métodos, né?
So Antonia has a question about this issue of collaborative and experimental, of the collaborative and experimental method. And she asks if you somehow relate this method to an anthropology that has been called, particularly in the US, an engaged anthropology by Stuart Kirsch, for example, or a militant anthropology by, I'm not sure who, I didn't catch the name. Quem é que você falou da antropologia militante, Antônia?
Jeffrey Juris.
Right, Jeffrey Juris. So that's your question.
I don't understand how anthropology cannot be engaged. I mean, I didn't go into anthropology to be disengaged with anything. I went into anthropology to be engaged with the world and its politics, and with, I mean, certainly at the personal level, to understand something about my difference, and difference that I could encounter and learn with and from. But I think the term engaged anthropology is ridiculous. I mean, I think it's an example of a way in which there's a creation of a hierarchy of different kinds of people who have who are imagined to be more or less politically good or bad or something else. I don't like all of this militant anthropology, engaged anthropology. The anthropology I've done has always been experimental. It's always been engaged. I don't know how it could be anything else. I don't think you can know about other people openly without experimenting, and I don't think you can care about other people openly without being engaged. So there's a lot of terms which people use these days to make what they do seem more important than what somebody else did, or they use this as a way of insulting something else that came before them, that they imagine, or to call a certain kind of anthropology colonial. Well, yes, there was a lot of anthropology that was in the service of colonial ideas and officials and so forth. And I've actually, in Australia, gotten to know a lot of people who worked as colonial officers and colonial anthropologists. And guess what? A lot of them are extraordinarily decent and very engaged people and have married into Papua New Guinea and become part of that world in some of the most sensitive and beautiful ways that I could possibly imagine. So I'm not at all willing to buy into this hierarchization or this political hierarchy of categories for anthropologists, and the bad ones are unengaged and the good ones are engaged. It all strikes me as kind of ridiculous and part of the current moment. At the same time, I should say I have the deepest respect in the world for Stuart Kirsch, who was a student of mine at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1980s, and who I've worked with in many ways over the years, and whose work I think is exemplary in Papua New Guinea. And I know he has the great respect of many Papua New Guineans, which matters a lot to me. And I think in Stuart's case, the word engaged anthropology came about as a result of doing what, I would think any, person of conscience would do in the situation he found himself in. When a lot of things were revealed, he basically started realizing that he was going to have to do as much anthropology in the offices of lawyers, environmental lawyers and corporations, as do research in villages in New Guinea. And of course, if you're going to be involved with mining, and you're going to be involved with questions like the ones that were faced by the people on the New Guinea border downstream from the Oktedi mine that Stuart worked with, of course, you have to be engaged. But just because you study lawyers or you study politicians or you study power doesn't mean you're engaged any more than, I can't imagine that, I think all of this is just kind of a charade. I'm sorry, I'm old and cranky about these kinds of things. I'm just too old to think that, just by naming something or calling yourself a certain name that somehow, you're radiating goodness in the world. To me, it's like putting the word organic in front of a food. To put the word engaged in front of the word anthropology is to put the word organic in front of carrot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Steve. Então, a resposta do Steve é que
Sorry.
Ele não entende. That's an excellent reply. Ele não entende como a antropologia pode ser qualquer coisa que não seja engajada, né? Ele diz que não entrou na antropologia para ficar desengajado com nada. Ele entrou na antropologia para se engajar com o mundo, com a política do mundo, e no nível pessoal para entender a sua diferença e a diferença que ele podia encontrar e com a qual ele podia aprender. Então, esse termo, para ele, de antropologia engajada, é ridículo. É um exemplo de como há uma criação de uma hierarquia, como se estabelece uma hierarquia de pessoas que são vistas como mais politicamente boas. Então, ele não gosta dessa antropologia militante engajada. A antropologia que ele faz sempre foi experimental, sempre foi engajada, e ele acha que não poderia ser outra coisa, que não se pode saber nada sobre outras pessoas sem ser experimental, e não podemos nos importar com outras pessoas sem nos engajarmos. Então, tem muitos termos ou expressões que as pessoas inventam para fazer parecer que o que fazem é mais importante ou que é melhor do que veio antes, e que antes era tudo colonial, por exemplo, e de fato muita coisa era. E Steve diz que conheceu muitos agentes coloniais na Austrália e que muitos são pessoas decentes, engajadas, que casaram na Papua Nova Guiné, que se tornaram parte desse mundo da maneira mais linda que ele pode imaginar. Então, ele não gosta dessas categorias hierárquicas, onde tem bons que são engajados, ruins que são não engajados. Ele acha isso ridículo. Claro, ele tem profundo respeito pelo trabalho do Stuart Kirsch, que foi aluno dele, e o trabalho do Kirsch é exemplar, e muita gente na Papua Nova Guiné respeita o Stuart Kirsch, o que para o Steve é muito importante. Então, no caso do Kirsch, ele acha a antropologia engajada surge do fato do Kirsch estar fazendo aquilo que qualquer pessoa consciente, decente, faria em seu lugar. Quando muita coisa foi revelada a ele, ele entendeu que teria que fazer antropologia tanto nos escritórios de advogados quanto em aldeias da Papua Nova Guiné. Se você vai trabalhar sobre mineração, com as questões que as pessoas lá lidam, claro que você tem que se engajar. Mas, só porque você estuda advogados ou políticos ou poder, isso não te faz mais engajado do que qualquer outro antropólogo. Isso é meio uma charada para ele. Ele pede desculpas, diz que é velho e mal-humorado, mas ele não acha que dar um nome, né, arrogar esse nome, dizer que esse nome representa você, que você irradia bondade no mundo. para ele, você botar engajado antes de antropologia, como colocar orgânico antes de comida. Faz sentido.
Bom, obrigado, Luiz. Obrigado, professor Steven Feld. Nós temos uma última pergunta agora da Tati. Tati, você vai se traduzir?
Eu acho que vou. Vou
Tá.
fazer primeiro em português. Minha pergunta, Steve, está relacionada a o evento da Beth e o filme, o recente filme que você fez. E eu queria perguntar sobre a relação entre figura e fundo, tanto de imagens sobrepostas e também de sons. Então, a relação entre figura e fundo nesse último filme, em que esses elementos de imagens fixas em movimento e sons estão em combinação, em composição. I'll try to do the translation, and if I don't do it well, you can help me, Luis. Steve, I wanted to talk to you and ask you about your wonderful film and ask you about how the play of the juxtaposition of images that come forward and then go back, and again how sound is also a layer. I would really like to hear you a little bit, as much as you can, on the experience of building the aesthetics of your film.
Yes, thank you so much. The film and the work in general that I'm doing now is being, these kinds of questions are being discussed in a book that I've just finished writing, which is called Research as Composition. And I talk about going from listening as composition to research as composition. And what I mean is to think about the way that the constant activity of sorting through ideas and memories and feelings and materials leads to, something that goes back to these questions about collaboration and co-creation and co-aesthetics and so forth. And I call all of this the compositional, and without going into that, I use the term compositional in articulation and overlapping with thoughts on that in conversation with Philippe Descola and contrary to the work of Bruno Latour. And composition for me is about the relationship between understanding research about how people compose their lives, how composition stands as a endlessly productive metaphoric field for thinking about the putting together of so many different kinds of things from different or disparate source materials, the way in which there's a compositional flow to things which involve different kinds of consonances and dissonances and disruptions. And I'm trying to think about my whole history of doing something called research as a search for ways to compose. At the same time, I'm trying to think about compositional process itself as a kind of research, as a way in which every move creates more questions. So I use the example, there was a little bit of this in the presentation today, like about the soundtrack of the Voices of the Rainforest film, and the question, why record a person singing when you can record the person singing and everything that they are hearing? And the idea of using the space and time of the rainforest and the possibility of dialogic auditing and dialogic editing and feedback and playback to create the kind of conditions where you co-aesthetically create something. So, you know, it took a year to create the soundtrack of this film, to digitize 22 hours of sound, transform them into 700 digital stems, remap them on a 24-hour space and time grid, layer them the way you see in the, you know, Pro Tools environment, understanding Pro Tools itself as a kind of research, you know, as a compositional space-time for research. In other words, taking research about what Ulahi hears with her left ear and her right ear and above her, and how 360 degrees of sound, you know, can create a stereo image or can create an immersive image or other kinds of things. And then, you know, in the section of the film where she's singing with the creek, we use hundreds of images, mixing drone, live camera, still photography of the map of her song and her feet moving through the forest to do a visual translation. So you have, you know, multiple essays in translation going on, while at the same time focusing all of that on what she is hearing in the creek and around her as she sings that path of place names that take you away from it. So that the kind of sonic anchor of the water and the way in which it moves in and out of visual immediacy. For me, these are all, you know, using compositional tools in media, in Pro Tools, in Avid, and so forth, in order to not just translate, but to do research on the conditions of hearing and on the conditions of representing, and to do research on the conditions of dialogism, on the possibilities of dialogism, not taking dialogism for granted because I've been talking to Ulahi for 45 years, but taking dialogism as something that's constantly renewed when two people can look at an image or a sequence of images together, or listen to a sound or a sequence of sounds together. So research as composition is, you know, contains a lot of material about the history of my relationship with Ulahi, and the way in which her compositional practices and my research practices intertwined, until, you know, her questions to me became as much about a kind of research of my conditions of knowing as my questions to her were all about her conditions of knowing, and how a history of singing together and taking singing lessons and sitting in waterways and singing with her for hours, you know, came to me to be as much about composing a life as composing a soundtrack for a film or for a CD.
Okay, então, o Steve agradece a pergunta. Ele fala que o filme, o trabalho em geral que ele faz agora, que essas questões ele está discutindo num livro que ele está escrevendo, chamado Research as Composition, né? A pesquisa enquanto composição, como composição, que fala sobre ouvir como composição, e a passagem de ouvir como composição para a pesquisa como composição. Então, pensar como a constante atividade de organizar ideias e memórias, sentimentos, materiais, leva a algo que remonta essas questões sobre colaboração, co-criação, co-estética, e ele chama isso de composicional, né? Que ele usa em articulação, sobretudo numa conversa com o Descolar, contra o trabalho do Latour. Então, composição, para ele, trata da relação entre compreender a pesquisa de como as pessoas compreendem as suas vidas. A composição é um campo metafórico produtivo sobre como nós juntamos coisas díspares, materiais tão distintos, né? É uma corrente composicional que envolve consonância, dissonância, rupturas, etc. Então, pensando na própria história dele de fazer a pesquisa como uma busca de meios de composição e o processo de composição como um tipo de pesquisa. Porque ele se pergunta, gravar alguém cantando, quando você pode gravar essa pessoa cantando e tudo que essa pessoa ouve ao mesmo tempo, né? Essa ideia de usar o espaço da floresta tropical por meio de edição digital, etc., de fazer camadas diferentes de som e criar as condições para fazer algo coestético. Então, teve um longo trabalho de edição para acertar essas camadas do que ele chama de Pro Tools, né, como um espaço-tempo composicional da pesquisa. Então, ele pesquisa o que ela, né, informante dele, cujo nome não vou me lembrar agora, ouve no ouvido direito, o que ela ouve no ouvido esquerdo, criando assim uma imagem estéreo e imersiva da experiência de ouvir e cantar. E no filme ele ainda usa, ele faz uma tradução imagética disso, né? Ele usa muitas imagens com drones, etc., para traduzir visualmente essa experiência. Então, muitos ensaios em tradução e, ao mesmo tempo, focando, enfim, muita tradução, ao mesmo tempo focando no que ela ouve e vê enquanto canta. E a âncora sônica, né, daqui ele chama de âncora sônica da água, como ela se move, como a água se move do campo de visão da informante enquanto ela canta. Então, ou seja, usar artefatos composicionais, pesquisar sobre a possibilidade do diálogo, né? Ele não entende o diálogo como algo que é dado, mas algo que é sempre renovado. Ele é renovado aqui quando duas pessoas se veem ao mesmo tempo uma imagem, etc. Então, a pesquisa enquanto composição, ela encerra muito da biografia dele, do Steve como pesquisador, e da vida da sua informante, como os dois se misturam e se intercalam. E as perguntas dela, né, sobre ele, Steve, são também tanto sobre as condições dele de conhecimento quanto vice-versa, né? É isso, cantar com ela é tanto sobre compor uma vida quanto compor uma trilha sonora. Acho que é mais ou menos isso.
Muito bom, muito bom. Então, a gente está chegando ao fim e queria, antes de tudo, thank you, Steve, for your time, for your generosity, for sharing with us so much. It was really a gift for us. Então, o que eu estava querendo dizer, que a gente está agradecendo, em primeiro lugar, o professor Steve, pela sua generosidade, por compartilhar tanto conhecimento e sabedoria com a gente. Queria também, em nome, né, tanto do Wagner, do Felipe e meu, agradecer a comissão de eventos do PPGSA, que foi fundamental para que a gente pudesse estar com essa estrutura bem montada aqui hoje, agradecer toda a paciência e todo o cuidado, e principalmente ao professor Luiz Costa, que fez uma tradução exemplar, muito importante, para que a gente possa se compreender nessas duas línguas, né? Então, Luiz, muito obrigada, e muito obrigada a todo mundo que veio, a gente ficou realmente muito feliz e emocionados com esse encontro. Então, terminamos, obrigada, boa tarde. Steve, thank you so much. Everyone is saying that they loved the presentation, the class. So everyone was really happy to be able to listen to you, to learn from you, and so thank you from all of us, and well, we're just happy. What's the name of your dog?
This is Andy.
Andy, okay.
Thank you, Steve. It was excellent. Great opportunity to hear you, and thank you, Tatiana and Wagner, for the invitation, and everyone for participating and for the questions and organizing. A real pleasure.
Yes, and thank you so much, Luis, for the translation. I know I've done these kinds of things in the languages in which I'm competent, and I know how difficult it is. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your willingness to do this today. And to Wagner and Felipe and Tatiana, I'm very, very happy that we were able to do this. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Andy sends hugs to you all too. He's only up here intervening because he wants his afternoon walk very much. And so I'm just trying to keep him calm until we all say goodbye, and then he and I hit the road.
Okay, okay. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much, Professor Steve.
Okay, bye-bye.